Hello, people of BookTube. It's Tony here from Locks to Reads. Happy New Year! It is obviously January. Obviously, you might come to this at a different time. It's January the 1st, 2025, and I am a few days off being 54 years old. And looking at me in this camera, God, do I look grey? If I shaved my beard off, I wouldn't look quite as bad. But anyway, this is just to cover what I read in 2024 and to pick out some favourites. I won't talk about them in too much detail because I'll be here all week. But let's do some basic stats. I read 168 books in 2024, which is the most I've read since I started keeping a proper track of how many books I read in a year. 18 of those were Doctor Who books. 72 were fiction of various kinds. One was a graphic biography, Red Rosa. 57 were non-fiction. 5 were plays, and 15 were poetry collections or anthologies. The poetry's down significantly on the last couple of years. The fiction is high. The non-fiction is high. The split is. I used to. I mean, obviously, theoretically, non-fiction includes some of the things that I've put under different categories. The Doctor Who books is about standard, I suppose. 17 of them were Doctor Who novelisations, and one was a non-fiction book, which I will mention in this summary. I've split my best of into fiction and non-fiction. There aren't exact numbers. There aren't 10 or 10. I haven't even counted them, but I've just kept listed the ones that I like reading. I'll start with fiction. Great Granny Webster by Carolyn Blackwood. That's a short book novel. It's about It's about family, odd family. It's based loosely on Carolyn Blackwood's own life, so would count as auto fiction. But it's very well written. It's very smart, and I enjoyed it a lot. The next is The Pollutant Speaks by Alex Cochran. That's a science fiction novel that is about the power of words and language to damage or change the world. It's set in the future. The lead character is a poet whose poem has taken on a life that he never intended it to have, and it then broadens out into something more. It's not space opera, but it's more sort of broad, about contact with alien life forms and how you communicate with alien life forms if their language and thought structures are not the same as yours. In fact, it has a lot in common with the next book that some in common thematically with the next book I'd like to recommend, which is Babel 17 by Samuel R. Delany. This is a classic science fiction novel. It's both a space adventure and thoughts on communication and codes and structures. I really enjoyed both those novels. I have a yearning to go back and read a lot of classic science fiction. I read a chunk of it when I was younger, but I've missed a lot of classics. And I'm sort of tempted to read more science fiction this year. I know I said I'd sort of outlined my plans for 2025, but they're always fluid and they're always going to be different. Next up was The Painted Veil by Somerset Maugham. That's a novel about a English woman in China during a pandemic. It's about her marriage, about the world she lives in. Really well written. It's the first Somerset Maugham book I'd ever read, and it makes me want to read more of his. I don't know if it's his best book. I don't know and therefore everything else is going to be a disappointment. But I really enjoyed it, and I would recommend it. Next, Silk by Alessandro Barrico. That's a very short novel about a Frenchman who travels to Japan to steal some silkworms so that the French silk industry can benefit. But it's also more fundamentally about love and loss and marriage and yeah, it's a beautiful book. It's short, but it's so beautifully written, and it took me by surprise that I enjoyed it so much. Um, Two Kurt Vonnegut novels next: Cat's Cradle and the Sirens of Titan. I don't think there's very few people that do odd, satirical, clever science fiction like Kurt Vonnegut. Um, I've started reading all his stuff. I read, I can't even remember what it's called now. I've read one of his most famous book, the title of which escapes me, which I had some issues with, but they were nothing to do with the writing and more to do with the sort of general background of the book. Um, I I found Cat's Cradle and the Sirens title really interesting to read. Funny. Cat's Cradle is very funny. Sirens of Titan is less directly obviously funny, but they're both great, impressive satires disguised as science fiction novels. Um, Next, Held by Anne Michaels. I read this part of the book, a long list. I didn't read most of the rest of it. I found it quite. I've started to come to the conclusion that I don't like modern fiction. I don't know if it's because I'm old, or whether I'm just tired of the same types of books always coming up on these lists, auto fiction especially. But I found this was one where I sort of started it and I thought, not sure. And I read it, and the more I read it, the more I liked it. And the more I liked it, the more it stuck with me. And even now, there are bits of it and there are ideas in it that I still think about. I found it a lovely book in the end. So yeah, that I would recommend that. I know a number from my friends who read it didn't like it very much, but I loved it, so it's on this list. Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon. This is set in Sicily after the Athenians failed to capture Sicily in a war. But it's about the power of literature. It's about grief. It's about punishment and vengeance, and it's about war. It's actually quite funny as well. The Ferdia Lennon makes a decision to the main characters talk in a sort of Northern Irish Belfast dialect, and it shouldn't work, but it works. And it's an easy read, and it's a funny read, and it's a moving read, and yeah, really recommend it. And that's a contemporary novel that I really liked. So there you go. So not everything is terrible. The next one is the word for world. The word for world is forest by Ursula K. Le Guin. That was part of the Hain series, which I've been reading in publication order. I believe you can read it in any order, but there is an order. There is a sort of order to it, but it isn't publication order. It's set on a world where the humans have arrived and they're basically wrecking the place. It's a novel about colonialism. Le Guin in her introduction actually says she thinks she could have been less. She could have been more subtle. And it's about the Vietnam War fundamentally, but it's also about the damage that resistance does to a culture. So that even if you defeat your colonial masters, their culture does permanent damage to yours, and it's how you might recover from that. It doesn't really get to that point in the book, but there's a follow up book to be written about whether you can change it. But yeah, I found that really such a brilliant book, and it's very short again. Next, the English Patient by Michael Ondiarchi. That's a novel set during World War II in Italy. There's a film made about it which I don't have any intention of watching. I really love the book though. The only quibble I have slightly is I didn't quite believe the ending, but it's a great, beautifully written story about love and betrayal and war and what war does to people. And I really enjoyed it. There's one very odd scene in it, but I loved it. So yeah, that's on my list. And finally, and probably my favourite book of the year, The Extinction of Irena Ray by Jennifer Croft. Now Jennifer Croft is a translator in the main. This is her first novel of her own. It's about translation, about translators, and about the relationship between translation, writing and the real world. I wasn't sure I was enjoying it. I genuinely was thinking of DNFing it early on. But in chapter 9, she throws a line in that I thought was so brilliant that I thought I'm going to read the rest of this book, and I'm really glad I did because I loved it in the end. It covers so much in terms of ideas, and I would highly recommend it. And keep if you feel like me after a first couple of chapters, stick with it because it gets really really good. So that's the fiction list. Now non-fiction. First up, In Search of Berlin, the story of a reinvented city by John Kampfner. That is, as it says there, a biography of Berlin told in vaguely chronological order, but each chapter has a sort of is all times and places, but referring back to the main events. I found it really interesting. I visited Berlin so long ago that the wall was still up, and I had to go through Checkpoint Charlie. I'd love to go again, and this book made me help me sort of build any itinerary in my head of where I'd want to go. The next one is the Doctor Who book, which is Paul Thwopen. It's basically by Paul Hayes. It's a book about how Doctor Who came to be created in 1962 and 1963. Paul wrote a book about the creation of the 2005 Doctor Who, which is also superb. But the amount of the research, the interviews, the thought involved in this, it's a really good in-depth picture of how a television series comes to be made. If you like Doctor Who, it's an essential read, I think. If you're interested in television history, I think it's a pretty essential read. There's a chapter in it by Sheep that's in there for a reason, which is about how the BBC covered the assassination of Kennedy, which will be worth reading in and of itself, regardless of all the other Doctor Who stuff. So yeah, I would recommend this as I think a general reader might not find it that as interesting as I did as a Doctor Who fan, but I would recommend it. Then there's a run of Chinese books about China. I read The Story of China by Michael Wood, which is a general history of China. China is one of the cultures I have a great big gap around, and therefore I wanted to read a good introduction. Michael Wood's a very interesting guy to watch and listen to, and the style is very straightforward, and it's clear that he's done the research, but it's one of those books which is a good starting point, because then you could go, okay, I like this bit, sounds most interesting, I'd like to read more about that. And the bibliography is great, so it's that good. And then, as a result of that, I read China's War with Japan, 1937 to 1945, by Rana Mitter. That's also a great book on a subject which I had vague knowledge of, but not that much. There's an argument to be had that World War II actually started in 1937 with Japan's attack on China. I think it's not an unreasonable argument. And this is the story of that war, but both politically and militarily. It's very well written, very well researched, and it gives you an idea of how cruel and unpleasant that hot warfare was. Which brings me on to the next book, which is The Rape of Nanking, The Forgotten Holocaust of World War II by Iris Chang. Now, I know YouTube has got weird rules about the use of certain words, even in videos about history and culture. It's very puritanical for an American. Well, that probably isn't surprising because it's an American-owned company, but you need to be a bit more grown up. That's just in passing. Nobody from YouTube's ever going to watch this. So anyway, that's about the specific events in Nanking. It is a hard book to read about a terrible event about which the Japanese are still in denial, about the scale of what was done. It's genuinely horrific, not just the death. Well, it's just horrific. The pictures in it are horrific, or a lot of them are horrific. It's not a book I recommend if you find these subjects difficult to deal with. I know it's real world, but it's still incredibly hard and unpleasant to read. And I am surprised the Chinese have ever forgiven the Japanese, to be honest, when you read a book like this. Next up, Blood and Power, The Rise and Fall of Italian Fascism by John Foote. This really changed my opinion of Italian fascism. I knew it was bad, but I always assumed it was quite light, isn't the right word, sort of diet fascism. But this book makes you really think about the amount of violence on both a small scale and large scale done by the fascists as they rose to power and when they were in power. The cruelty and the fact that they never really got closure. Unlike Germany, Italy post-war never really. There were trials and things, but people kept getting released under clemency rules by different governments, and some people never got prosecuted at all, really, for what they did to sort of communists and socialists in the rise and follow-up of fascism. Obviously, Mussolini and his poor mistress got their comeuppance, as did a handful of the people, but they were not. It wasn't. I think it's important with these things. The same with the Japanese. Although there were a number of small trials, there were not enough, and too much protection of people in authority was done by people that should know better. I include in this things as well like Operation Paperclip and von Braun. There's a lot of people from World War II who never got who never got the justice they deserved, and there's a lot of people who got injustice, but that's a cool talk for another day. Then there's The Crusade Through Arab Eyes by Amin Maalouf. I don't know if I've pronounced that name correctly. Sorry if I haven't. That's as it says. It's a story of the Crusades from an Arabic point of view. I knew a little bit about the Crusades, obviously from the Western point of view. This is a really good book though, because it talks through the whole thing. It talks about Arab responses. It talks about why it took so long to drive them out of Jerusalem and various other places in the Middle East, and how that series of events sort of affected the Middle East in general, even possibly up till now. Also, the Christians were terrible when they invaded Jerusalem. They were awful. And I know it's a long time ago, but we should remember that when people start talking about Muslim fundamentalism, just because something is now isn't now doesn't make it any less fundamentalist. Next, 1945, Victory in the West by Peter Caddick Adams. That's a military history of the end of the war in Europe, in Western Europe. Very good book, very well written, narrative driven. Covers a lot of covers all the events and the battles leading up to the defeat of the Germans in the West. It's the first Peter Caddick Adams book I've read, although his name has come up a few times. I really, really enjoyed it. It's a big chunky book, but it's definitely worth a read. Next, and probably my favourite non-fiction book I read this year, Killing Thatcher by Rory Carroll. This is the story about the attempt to blow up Margaret Thatcher in Brighton. It talks through the planning, the actual events of the bombing itself, the attempts to save people from the ruined hotel, and the manhunt afterwards. It's a non-fiction book, but it reads like a thriller. It reads like a Frederick Forsyth novel, one of his good ones. It's got the prose is it's really well researched. He talks to a number of people involved, including the person who planted the bomb themselves. And I really, really enjoyed it. I think that's probably the best. That and Question 7 by Richard Flanagan, which is the next one I wanted to mention, which is about it's really about what the cost of war is on individuals and on societies. Again, it sort of has Japan in its eyes, its sights, but not just Japan, because it talks about sort of bombing by the Western powers, and he talks about his own family and his father, who fought in the war. It's a very good, but that's a very good book. But yeah, I'd say Question 7 and Killing Thatcher were probably the two best non-fiction books I read all year. Next, Material World by Ed Conway. I mentioned that book in a previous video. It's about the five main materials that drive the modern world. Four of which drove, well, four of which have driven the world for a long, long time. The last of which, lithium, is a more recent thing of value. And finally, Reprobates by the Cavaliers of the English Civil War by John Stubbs. That's about the Cavaliers of the English Civil War. It's about the Civil War as well in more general. It's a sort of general history using the Cavaliers or the leading Cavalier poets and politicians as a sort of loop to hook the general story of the English Civil War around. Other people do get mentioned. Like Milton gets a mention. It really made me want to read Paradise Lost this year. A book that I keep thinking about reading, but has always scared me a little bit, which I find surprising because I've read Proust and I've read The Divine Comedy by Dante, which I recommend. I read that this year. Fantastic book. I read the Penguin Classics translation by the translator's name I can't remember. I would like to read another translation. It's beautiful poetry. It has a lot of footnotes, but I think you could probably get your head around most of the things in there without needing the footnotes, because a lot of the footnotes are just about the people. If you've read, there is probably some preparatory reading you could do that would help. It would help if you've read the Bible. It would help if you've read the Aeneid. It would help if you've read Ovid and Lucan. But they aren't essential, I don't think. And the footnotes are there and the introduction is there to help. But yeah, I found The Divine Comedy a beautiful poem. It's very strange because obviously it was written in the 14th century and in a particular place, Florence. So it has particular things to say about that. Which makes it interesting. But I found I found that most of the points he was making were understandable, even if you didn't know who, let's say in hell, the people being punished, their names don't necessarily have to mean anything, because you can guess who they were or what they were doing from how they're being punished. But yeah, I think it's a book. If you were to read, I mean, you don't have to read the whole Bible, but a little preparatory reading before you start it would probably help. But I don't think it's essential. I think great book. Here we go. This is a little bit of philosophy, thought. I think great books can stand or fall without introductions and without footnotes. Sometimes you won't get everything on the first read if you don't look at the footnotes. You don't read the introduction. I'm reading William Langland's Piers Plowman at the moment, which is written roughly about the same time as maybe a little later than The Divine Comedy, and that is full of allusions, biblical references. It has quotes, little sort of political. You could tell there's a sort of political thing underlying it, based on the plague that ravaged through Europe and the Peasants' Revolt, and about the problems with the church. You can kind of see in it the foundations of a sort of a Reformation, even though it's whether William Langland meant that or not, I don't know. But it's an interesting read, and I think you could read it and get something out of it without referring to the many footnotes. The footnotes obviously help. Again, this is why I kind of want to do my great reading progress. Was part of the reason I wanted to do it was that if you read, let's say the world literature and publication order, the references in later literature to earlier literature become easier to deal with without you having to rely on other people's notes and other people's thoughts. Introductions in Penguin Classics and Oxford's World Classics are great, but they do have a tendency to give you a line of thought to go under, rather than you opening a book and thinking about it yourself. That's not necessarily. So my view is you read the book, then you read the introduction, and you refer to the notes if you feel you need to refer to the notes. I will say I'm egotistical and love to be proud of myself whenever I know something without having to refer to and I look at the note, and the note is exactly what I thought it was talking about. But no man is without ego. No person is without ego. So that's my reading for the year. This video has gone on a bit long, but I was talking about a lot of books. I'll list them all underneath for you to refer to, so just in case you don't get them as I go along, because I was going quite fast. I had a good reading year. I do want to read better next year. I do sometimes think my speed of reading is a bad thing. It allows me to read lots of books, but I don't know if I read them as I've mentioned this before. I don't know if I read them as well as I should. There is a difference between breadth of reading and depth of reading. I've read a lot, but how much of it I've read in depth, I don't know. But I do know that in certain areas, the amount of stuff I've read on that subject has kind of combined together to make something useful. So whenever I read a book on certain subjects, I kind of feel like I've got the foundations in place. What passes for my classical education, which was O-level and A-level, GCSE and A-level Latin, does really help when you're reading ancient and medieval literature, even if really at the time it didn't seem like it would. Yeah, so that's it. I'm waffling now, and this is going to be almost half an hour long. There's no wonder nobody watches my videos. They're all far too long. But there you go. I hope you had a good Christmas. Happy New Year. And I look forward to more videos in 2025 that hopefully won't be quite as long and waffling as this. And I might even learn to edit at some point in 2025. But don't hold your breath. All right, goodbye.